Wyoming, 1885. Out here, the land doesn't care what's in your pockets, it only asks what's in your hands and what's in your heart. This is the story of a man who owned nothing. No land, no cattle, not even the horse he rode. And it's the story of the one afternoon that changed everything he thought he knew about being poor. Before I tell you what happened on that porch, let me tell you where I came from, because it matters. I grew up 40 miles east of here, the son of a dirt farmer who lost 2 crops to drought before I turned 10. My father never had 2 coins to rub together in his whole life, but he had one rule he drilled into me so deep it became part of my bones. A man's word is the only thing he truly owns. Everything else, land, cattle, money, the world can take from you in a single bad season. Your word, nobody can take. You can only give it away yourself by breaking it. I buried my father when I was 19, sold what little we had to pay his debts honestly instead of walking away from them the way some men would have, and I rode west with a bedroll, a rifle, and that one rule. Some men would call that a poor inheritance. I never once thought of it that way. My name is Jacob Coyle, and if you'd asked me, back in the spring of 1885, what I had to offer the world, I would have laughed and told you. Not much. A pair of hands, a strong back, and a word that I had never once broken. Would that be enough for you? Because out here in Wyoming, it almost never was. I rode line for the Bar W spread, the biggest outfit for 60 miles in any direction, owned by a man named Thomas Whitfield. Line riding is lonely work. You spend your days patching fence, pushing stray cattle back where they belong, sleeping under stars so thick they look like spilled sugar. You don't get rich doing it. You get calluses and quiet and time to think. And I had a lot of time to think about her. Emily Whitfield, the boss's only daughter. I'd known her the way a hired hand knows the family that owns the ranch he works. From a respectful distance, hat in hand, yes ma'am, no ma'am. But there was a Sunday in April when the distance closed up without either of us planning it. The church wagon threw a wheel on the road back from Laramie, and I was riding by. I stopped, because that's what you do. I got my hands dirty and my shirt torn, and by the time that wheel was back on its axle, Emily Whitfield had asked me my name 3 times, like she wanted to be sure she wouldn't forget it. I want to ask you something. Have you ever met someone and felt the whole shape of your future shift, quiet as a change in the wind? That's what that Sunday felt like to me. She'd been sitting up on that stalled wagon in her Sunday best, a pale yellow dress with her mother's old shawl around her shoulders, and instead of fretting the way most folks would over a ruined afternoon, she climbed right down into the mud beside me and asked if she could hold the jack steady while I worked the wheel free. I told her a lady oughtn't kneel in the road like that. She looked at me square and said, "A lady oughtn't let a man do dirty work alone while she stands there looking pretty." I was raised better than that, Mr. Coyle. I didn't have a single thing to say back to that. I just handed her the jack. I told myself it was nothing. A rancher's daughter and a line rider, that's not a story anybody tells. That's a story people warn you against. But nothing has a way of becoming something if you let it. Over that summer, I found reasons. A fence that needed checking near the house. A message I could have sent with any of the other hands, but somehow always carried myself. And Emily, she found her own reasons too. She'd bring water out to the men working the north pasture. She always poured mine last and lingered a little longer doing it. We never said much, not at first, just weather and cattle and the mountains turning purple at dusk. But some conversations aren't about the words at all. Some are about who's willing to stand still and listen. By July, I knew. I loved Emily Whitfield, the way the plains love the rain after a hard, dry spell, completely and a little desperately, because I knew how easily it could be taken away. There was an evening in early July I still carry with me clearer than most of my own wedding day. A storm had rolled in fast off the mountains, the kind of Wyoming storm that turns the sky the color of a bruise in about 10 minutes flat. I was still out checking fence near the home pasture when it broke, and I took shelter under the eave of the old tack shed, soaked through, figuring I'd wait it out alone, same as always. Except Emily came running through that rain, skirts soaked black to the knee, laughing like she'd never once worried about ruining a good dress in her life. She ducked under that eave next to me, breathless, rain dripping off her chin, and she said, "I saw you out here from the kitchen window. I couldn't just watch you stand in it by yourself." We didn't say much else. We just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, watching lightning split the sky over the Laramie Range. And I remember thinking that I had never in my life felt less poor than I did in that exact moment, soaked to the bone under a leaking shed roof. Isn't it strange? The things that make a man feel wealthy? It was never money that did it for me. It was a woman choosing to stand in the rain next to me when she didn't have to. And here's where I have to tell you about Randall Pierce. Randall was the son of the Laramie Bank president. He had money the way some men have shadows. It just followed him everywhere, without him ever having to think about it. He'd started calling on Emily that same summer, with flowers from Cheyenne and a shiny new buggy, and everyone assumed that was simply how the story would end. The rancher's daughter marries the banker's son. It's the tidy ending. It's the ending that makes sense on paper. Have you ever watched something make sense on paper while your whole chest tells you it's wrong? I watched Randall Pierce court Emily at socials and barn dances, watched him hand her down from that buggy like she was a piece of property he was inspecting, and I told myself I had no right to feel what I felt. What did I have that could compete with a bank account? Nothing. That was the plain truth of it. Nothing at all. I remember one social at the Grange Hall where Randall stood up in front of half the valley and announced loud enough for everyone to hear that he intended to build Emily a house in Laramie with a real glass conservatory imported all the way from Denver. People clapped. Someone whistled. Emily smiled the polite smile she wore for occasions like that. I'd come to know the difference between that smile and her real one, the one that reached her eyes, and Randall never once got the real one, not that I saw. I stood in the back of that hall in my one good shirt, and I felt about 2 inches tall. What was I going to offer standing next to a glass conservatory from Denver? A fence I'd mended? A horse that wasn't even mine? But here's a thing I noticed, and it took me weeks to understand why it mattered. Randall Pierce talked about Emily constantly, what he'd give her, what she'd have, what people would think when they saw her on his arm. He hardly ever seemed to talk to her. Not really. Not the way you talk to somebody you're trying to understand. But Emily, she started finding me anyway, after services, at the Mercantile. Once, in the pouring rain, under the eave of the feed store, she looked at me with rain running down that calico dress and said, "Jacob Coyle, you talk to me like I'm a person and not a prize. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" I didn't have an answer for that. I just knew my hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. By August, we were meeting where we shouldn't have, down by the cottonwoods along the creek, where the water ran slow and gold in the evening light. I'd ride out after my work was done, and she'd slip away after supper, and for an hour, maybe 2, the whole unfair architecture of who had what and who deserved who simply didn't exist. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think you already know the answer. If you've ever loved someone you weren't supposed to love, because of money or class or simple bad timing, tell me down in the comments. I have a feeling I'm not the only one who stood at that creek, wondering if honest love could possibly be enough. And while you're down there, if this story is finding its way into your chest the way it found its way into mine, do me a kindness and hit that subscribe button. I've got a whole shelf of these Wyoming stories, and I'd be glad of the company while I tell them. Now, back to the creek and the trouble that was coming for us. Word got back to Thomas Whitfield, the way word always does in a small territory. One of the other hands, I never did learn which, mentioned seeing his daughter walking home from the cottonwoods at dusk, and mentioned who she'd been walking with. Thomas Whitfield summoned me to the main house on a Thursday evening in September. Not to the bunkhouse where a hired hand belongs, to the house, the big house with its lamplight glowing gold in every window, looking like something I had no business approaching. I want you to understand what that walk up to the porch felt like. My boots on those wooden steps sounded like gunshots in my own ears. I had rehearsed 100 different things to say, and every one of them evaporated the moment Thomas Whitfield opened that door and looked at me with those pale, unblinking eyes. I'd spent the whole ride over composing speeches in my head, the kind of speech I imagined might convince a wealthy rancher that a broke line rider deserved his only daughter. I tried out a dozen different versions under my breath the whole 4 miles from the bunkhouse, and every single one of them sounded to my own ears like a man trying to talk his way into something he hadn't earned. By the time I tied my horse to the hitching post out front, I'd given up on all of them. I decided I would simply tell him the truth, whatever it cost me, and let the chips land where they landed. He didn't invite me in. He stood on the porch in his shirt sleeves, arms crossed, and he said, "I hear you've been keeping company with my daughter, Coyle." There was no point lying. I have never in my life found a lie that sat right in my mouth, and I wasn't about to learn how that night. "Yes, sir," I said. "I have." "Randall Pierce is calling on her too," he said. Not a question. A fact laid down between us like a hand of cards. "I know that, sir." He studied me a long moment. Behind him through the window, I could see Emily standing in the hallway, not quite hidden, her hand pressed flat against her chest, like she was trying to keep her own heart in place. "Then tell me, Coyle," Thomas Whitfield said, "what exactly do you imagine you have to offer my daughter? Randall Pierce can give her a house in town, servants, a name that opens doors. What can you give her?" This is the moment. This is the moment I've been building toward this whole time, and I want you to really sit with it, because I did not have a clever answer ready. I had the truth and only the truth, and I was terrified it would not be enough. I took my hat off. I looked him square in the eye, the way my father taught me a man looks at another man when he means what he's saying. "Sir," I said, "I have nothing to offer your daughter." The porch went so quiet I could hear the creek a quarter mile off. "I don't own land," I said. "I don't own the horse under my saddle. That's a Bar W horse, same as I've ridden for 3 years for your outfit. I've got $40 saved and a trunk with 2 shirts in it. I can't give Emily a house in town or a name that means anything to anybody outside of this valley. I can't give her what Randall Pierce can give her, not one bit of it, and I won't stand here and pretend otherwise." Thomas Whitfield's face didn't move, not an inch. "What I can give her," I said, and here my voice did shake, I won't pretend it didn't, "is a man who has never once lied to her and never will. I can give her a man who'll be at that creek every evening of his life if she wants him there, rain or shine, rich or poor. I can give her honesty when it costs me something, same as it's costing me right now, standing on your porch admitting I've got nothing. That's the whole of what I have, sir. It isn't much, but it's true, every word of it. Have you ever said something you knew might cost you everything simply because it was true? That's the loneliest kind of brave there is. I stood there afterward with my hat still in my hands, feeling every second of that silence stretch out like the whole rest of my life was balanced on it. And I made myself a promise right then. Whatever happened next, I would not take a single word of it back. Thomas Whitfield stood there so long, I was certain I'd just talked myself out the gate for good. I could see Emily's hand pressed harder against the window glass now. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the last time I'll stand on this porch. And then, slow as a Wyoming sunrise, Thomas Whitfield smiled. It wasn't a small smile either. It cracked clean across that stern, weathered face like the first light breaking over the Laramie Range. "Coyle," he said, "do you know what Randall Pierce told me when I asked him that very same question 3 weeks ago?" I shook my head. "He told me he'd give her everything a woman could want, every last thing. He had an answer for every question I put to him, smooth as a river stone, and I have not trusted one word that man has said to me since, because no man alive has everything, and only a liar claims he does." He stepped down off that porch, right up close to me, and set a hand on my shoulder, the first time Thomas Whitfield had ever touched me as anything but hired help. "You're the most honest man in Wyoming, son," he said. "And in my experience, honest men are the only ones who keep their word once they've got a ring on a woman's finger instead of just before it. I'd rather my daughter own nothing beside an honest man than everything beside a liar." I don't know how to describe what happened in my chest right then. like something that had been clenched tight for 6 months finally let go all at once. The front door opened before either of us could say another word, and Emily came out onto that porch with her eyes shining and her hand already reaching for mine, like she'd been waiting behind that door her whole life for permission she never actually needed. Not from her heart, only from the world. Thomas Whitfield cleared his throat, the way men do when they've shown more feeling than they're comfortable with, and said, "Well, don't just stand there, Coyle. Come inside. Man's going to marry my daughter ought to at least see the inside of the house." We were married that November, under the cottonwoods by the creek, the very same trees where we used to meet in secret. Randall Pierce sent a formal note of congratulations from Cheyenne, and I believe he meant it kindly enough in his way. Some men simply want different things than honesty. That doesn't make them villains. It only means they were never going to be the right answer for a woman like Emily. Emily wore her mother's wedding dress that day, altered by her own hands, not a single thread of it bought new, and she told me afterward it was the only dress she'd ever worn that felt like it actually belonged to her. Thomas Whitfield walked her down through the cottonwoods himself, and when he placed her hand in mine, he leaned in close and said, low enough that only I could hear it, "Don't you ever make a liar out of me, Coyle." I told him I intended to spend the rest of my life proving him right instead. Thomas Whitfield gave us 40 acres at the edge of the Bar W as a wedding gift, not out of pity, he made sure to tell me, but because a man who tells the truth, even when it costs him, deserves a fair start. I built Emily a house with my own 2 hands on that land, board by board, same as I'd have built anything worth keeping, slow and honest and true. It wasn't a grand house. No glass conservatory, no imported anything. 2 rooms the first winter, a third added on come spring, a porch I built wide enough for 2 rocking chairs because I never wanted to sit out an evening without her beside me. Neighbors came to help raise the roof beam the way neighbors do out here, and Thomas Whitfield himself showed up in his shirt sleeves with a hammer in his hand, working alongside men he'd have called hired help a year before. I think that surprised people more than the wedding did. Randall Pierce married a judge's daughter from Cheyenne the following spring, and from what I hear they get on well enough. I bear him no ill will. He wanted a different kind of life than the one Emily and I built, and there's no shame in a man knowing what he wants, even if it isn't honesty above all else. I only know that Emily would have withered in that life, the way a wildflower withers behind glass, no matter how fine the glass. We have 3 children now, 2 boys and a girl, and every one of them has heard this story so many times they can practically recite it back to me. My youngest even does an impression of Thomas Whitfield's stern voice that gets his grandfather laughing until he has to wipe his eyes. I tell them this story every single year, on the anniversary of that Thursday evening on the porch, because I want them to understand something that took me 35 years and 1 terrifying walk up some wooden steps to learn. My eldest boy asked me once if I was ever afraid, standing there admitting I had nothing. I told him the truth. I was more afraid in that moment than I'd ever been facing down a stampede or a Wyoming blizzard. But I told him fear and honesty aren't opposites. Sometimes the most honest thing a man can say is the thing he's most afraid to say out loud. That's usually how you know it matters. The world will tell you that what you have to offer is measured in land and money and names that open doors. But there is another kind of wealth. There is the wealth of a man's word, kept quietly, year after year, when no one is watching and nothing forces him to keep it. I had nothing to offer Emily Whitfield that Thursday evening in September of 1885. Nothing but the truth. And it turned out, in the end, that the truth was the only thing worth having at all. If this story moved something in you tonight, I'd be grateful if you'd stay a little longer with us. Tell me, down in the comments, what you would have said, standing on that porch with everything to lose and nothing but honesty in your hands. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, subscribe and come sit with me again next week. There's always another story waiting out here on the Wyoming plains.